Arjun, maybe you can talk a little bit about, your company, HCC, has executed many of India's landmark infrastructure projects, and including ones in hydropower, nuclear power, roads, bridges, tunnels. India is now the most populous nation with almost 1.5 billion people. And some estimates are calling for the Indian construction industry to grow from 900 billion to 2.1 trillion by 2030. So what challenges have you faced, and what are the lessons that can be drawn for accelerating future infrastructure development in India and elsewhere?
Arjun, thank you. India finally has an infrastructure program that it's deserving of. 750 billion was spent in the last 5 years. 1.5 trillion is planned for the next 5 to 7. And there's still a gap. Think tanks estimate that to be about 5 trillion. But the solution for India and the rest of the world is not just simply throwing billions and trillions towards a gap. It's getting the public infrastructure correct. Right? I think it's fundamentally clear that infrastructure spend has a huge impact on economic growth, on societal impact, and that there's a multiplier effect in developing countries, much, much more than it is in the West. What's less known, however, is how underperforming certain large infrastructure projects can be. And if you actually look at the 3 broad metrics of cost, time, and betterment being defined as has the job achieved its purpose, you have less than 10% of large infrastructure spend actually meets the metrics on cost and time, and only less than 1% actually meets all 3. So these are damning statistics, and it really begs the question of getting back to basics. So if I give a perspective from our learnings in India, first and foremost, invest tons in public study and planning before you execute. And 1 billion people around the world live without electricity. Another billion live more than 2 kilometers away from an all-weather road. And the temptation is to proportionally invest. But what India has done, and done wisely, is to look at the validating impact, where the social impact and the economic impact is the greatest. And that does mean some unequal development from time to time. But what you then do in the long run is you end up closing the gap a lot swifter. The world has got tremendously complex in the last 10, 20 years. If you take India's story and development and you superimpose on that the variables of sanitation, water, hospitals, schools, green spaces, you start to analyze intra-city versus intercity, roads versus electricity, urban versus rural. And in India, this last variable is so complex because you have an urban migration that's taking place, that took place in Europe over centuries. 300 million Indians are migrating to urban centers in 40 years. So this is an incredibly complex matrix. For example, the greatest return on road building in India is not driven by the amount of concrete you pour or the design of the road. Now, these are important elements. It's the foresight you have in land acquisition over 20, 30 years. Yeah. So, lesson 1 is tons of public study, think super slow and then act fast. Second, build really world-class agencies and institutions that transcend political cycles. And again, India's done that so well so that today we have the 2nd largest road network in the world. We have the 3rd largest underground metro rail, all done fairly recently. And I can go on with the statistics. But there's 2 or 3 related subtleties with regard to. So one, try to get the best kind of master builder leadership of these agencies. Because with that sort of genius leadership comes the building of great teams. It comes, accurate forecasting of projects so that you don't set them up for failure. You have adequate risk sharing between the public and private sector that then actually finally gets you to that holy grail of public-private partnership, best, in-class design execution. And again, there is no substitute in my industry for execution. And when you do that, you then actually drive private sector viability to it, which, if you look at India's example, we've gone from an investment by the private sector of, 10% of total infrastructure spend, which is the developing country average, to now 22%. And, the goal in the next number of years is to achieve that high watermark of 33% that you have in the West. I'll end on a bit of a cautionary note on what we do need to do from an execution standpoint as a private sector, is build capacity. I mean, if we want to double and quadruple the size of our program, the technical and strategic capacity you need to have, the number of engineers, architects, consultants, financial wizards, urban planners, the kind of skilling that you require in our construction workforce. And the bedrock underneath that is our educational establishments and our skilling agencies, which today we are short of, frankly. And so the private sector does need to do its bit in terms of the capacity building there with the support of the government, obviously, so that we can actually have the infrastructure, we actually implement the infrastructure program that we deserve.